Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation. Absolutely delighted to be here with all of you who might be watching this live or who will watch it live or might come back and see this as a recording. I'm absolutely happy and delighted to be here with Maria. My name is Reena Dayal. I'm a leadership accelerator and I'm one of the hosts for TBQ Live. And I have with me today Maria Chase.
Hi, so lovely to be here, Reena, especially after last week's technical issues. So really happy to be talking about such an important topic today. Lovely to be here. Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much for reminding us. Absolutely. So an apology from both Maria and I. We did have some technical problems last time, which is why we had to postpone this important topic. But we do know it's important. So we are back being here with you to talk about the science and art of unconscious bias. Now, this is a topic that has become quite controversial, with a lot of companies deciding whether they should do or not do this training, whether they should set us aside, whether it is effective or not effective. And we just wanted to grab that conversation and turn it around. But today we're going to be talking about really what is unconscious bias and what is the controversy behind it and why we might want to reconsider putting it up on the shelf and maybe thinking about dusting it off and bringing it back into our conversations. So today is part one of a two-part series. We're going to be talking of the science of unconscious bias.
Okay. So TBQ Live, we do this every couple of weeks unless we have some technical hitches. And we cover one or more subjects that are part of Reena's brilliant book, The Brilliance Quotient. And it's a conversation about raising awareness, exploring, discussing solutions, but also getting close to topics. We can't always solution everything. Sometimes it's just about getting some more information and getting closer. So obviously hosted by Reena and myself, we're going to be here with you for 45 minutes talking about unconscious bias today and getting close to that particular subject. But before we start that, let's start with the story, because that will illustrate exactly what we're trying to get to. It's a tricky one. All right, over to you, Reena.
Right. So there is a story and there's a question for you. And if you're going to be watching us live, then do give your responses on the chat or think about the response if you're watching it as a recording. It is an interesting one and it sits at the heart of this topic of unconscious bias. And in fact, I had covered this in one of the chapters of the Brilliance Quotient, which is around reframing diversity. So one of the 9 levers covered in the book. So what's that question and story? Here's how it begins. So I want you to imagine that you're in a car, and I want to imagine that a close friend or family member is driving that car and you're sitting in the passenger seat. Now you're going around this empty, deserted road. It's a countryside. There's nobody around. And the car is going beyond the speed limit. It's 40 miles an hour, but the car is going far higher than 40 miles an hour as your friend or family member is stepping on the gas and racing down that empty road. And it's just defying the weather. You do kind of mention to your family, the person that you visualize, to say, you're going over the speed limit. Do you want to slow down? And the person shrugs it aside, lowers down the speed and then speeds up again. And as you turn the corner, you get into this rather small, quaint village, which often happens if you're going through a countryside. And you're swinging through that deserted village. And as you take the next turn, there's an old lady who's crossing the road. And because your car is coming at such a tremendous speed, your car knocks her down. Obviously, you'll stop the car, you'll get down, and you'll approach the lady, and she is injured, clearly. So you call for the paramedics, you call the ambulance. And the ambulance arrives. She's grievously injured. She's unconscious. She's being looked after by the paramedics at that point of time. And they're doing the emergency first aid. And they call the cops, the police as well, because obviously it looks like an accident scene. And the police arrive and they look around. They do their, seeing where the car is, how the car has been damaged, and the lady per se. And then they approach you. And they approach you and they say, you know what, this is such a deserted village. We have no CCTV camera. We have no witnesses right now. You are actually our only witness because there's nobody else around. And they ask you, what happened? How did this really occur? Or was it going too fast? Or what happened? Just can you tell us? You're our only witness. The question for you is this: what will you say? You know that the repercussions of saying that, yes, this person that you mentioned was driving way above the speed limit and that caused the accident. Would you tell that or would you not? That is the question and the dilemma. What do you do? I'm going to pause there for 5 seconds to let some answer flash up in your mind about what you think you might have to do. And because you don't have to share it, you can also be very honest, because I do know when I ask this question in a lot of training programs that I run. And I was asked this question to now more than 500 people in different kind of workshops. And it's very interesting to know the responses that come in. Okay, so I think you might have had got that answer in your head. And let me just take you to the next level of this case study, which is a live case study that was kind of relayed with a group of people in a global organization. And that's the first time it was ever asked, actually, I think, or at least that's the narrative that was told to me. And they were trying to discuss a value that they had called integrity. And this case, this example, this whatever scenario was shared with the group to help them identify what does integrity mean. And as you can imagine, there were two camps of responses. There was a camp of people who said yes, they will tell the truth. Some of them really clear about it, which is what I often see in responses, or some people who qualify and say that they will probably say the truth. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who don't tell the truth, and for their own reasons as well. And the interesting bit that happens is the debrief that takes place straight after that. Because the people who so called tell the truth look at the people who don't tell the truth and they say, well, they're liars, aren't they? So I'm not going to trust them. They have no integrity. And they do it because of their value systems that they might have. They might be because of the cultural backgrounds they have, the faith or trust they have with the authorities. There might be millions of reasons, but that's how they decode it. And on the other side, the people who kind of said, no, they will not tell the truth, look at this other group of people and say, oh, wait a minute. So these individuals don't even trust or cannot stand up for their friends and family members. Will they ever stand up for me? Do they really have any integrity? So you suddenly had the word integrity being defined in different ways. And the camp of people who kind of said no was because of many reasons. It might be culture, or because family is first for them, or maybe because they don't have faith in the authorities. There could be, again, million reasons. But it's interesting, because of what their filters were, they have a stance and how they interpret the other person's response. So that's what the story is, and kind of starts revealing to you how deeply embedded something known as bias can exist. So back to you, Maria.
Thanks so much, Rina. And that just absolutely shows people instantly go to how they feel right. And how we feel right is unconscious. So here are just a few of the definitions. That unconscious bias is any detectable bias of our attitudes or our behavior that operate outside of our awareness. Now, that was a very thinking question. So people did have the opportunity to think. The difference is what we think is also hooked into our wiring. And in a second, we're going to look at how the brain is wired and why we go to these shortcuts, which is what unconscious bias is. It's that knee-jerk perception. It's that unconscious or implicit bias that is instinctive. It's also about our assumptions, our genders, our age, our culture. So if we go on to the next slide, it's a very silly and very simple slide. If you have a brain, you have biases. And if you don't have a brain, you don't have biases, but neither will you be joining us today live on this restream. So if we go on to the next slide, Rina, the reason that we have unconscious bias is because we receive so much information in. The current figures are that we receive 34 gigabytes of information every day. If you want to break that down, that's about the fact that we're absorbing 100,000 words, or it's 23 words per second. Now, the brain was made to move us away from threat and towards reward. So all the information that I'm taking in means the brain wants to know, is this okay? Am I still being safe? Because that's the brain's overarching organizing principle. It's what it does first. So in order to make sure that we can absorb all of this information, we have a dual processing of all the data coming in. The first one on the left side of Dan Kahneman's system of thinking is our unconscious. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about unconscious bias. It's instinctive, it's automatic. There's no effort. Thinking, which is conscious thinking, which is on our PFC, I always touch my forehead because that's where it's located, actually is a very energy intensive system. It uses 20% of the body's overall resources. So if we cannot consciously think, what the brain does instead is it vision maps. So it hooks it to whatever is already in our brain. So those are our experiences. So for example, if you've been bitten by a certain breed of dog, you're not going to warm to that dog again, because that is a quick shorthand for your brain to go, there's one of those dogs. I'm not going to do anything about that. I'm going to walk in the opposite direction. It's also about not only our experience of how we've lived, so all of that wiring that it's hooking onto, it's also about our cultural experiences. So for example, to use a great example of women doing childcare, if I drive past a school and 85% of people I see at that school are women, I am going to get that stereotype in my mind that actually women are the people who do the main amount of childcare. And what happens is when I see it, the neural pathway that thinking is going down is being myelinated even more, which is a sheath which passes the signals really, really, really quickly. So the brain takes the path of least resistance because it's saving energy. The brain's a brain saving energy. So it's about the fact that if I can use stereotypes, if I can use general assumptions, all women, most women are the people who provide childcare, for example. I'm also not a victim. I kind of want to say victim, but that doesn't seem quite the right word. But I'm also imbibing a huge amount of media, social media, all of the media that is going on, that my brain is just, it's just shorthanding. It's just hooking it on, all this information onto the parts that are already there. What happens though is we reinforce that thinking. So unless we are conscious, we are unconsciously biased, and it's those biases which are driving all of our behaviors until we bring it into the consciousness. So it becomes automatic. It takes 50 milliseconds to recognize that someone coming towards you, their gender, is it male or female? That's survival. If I'm a woman, another woman coming towards me is less threatening, possibly, than a man. And it's worth bearing in mind that bias is the brain's shorthand. So it's not always negative. It's about getting the thinking to be as quick as we need it to be. So if I know that I like chocolate ice cream, I don't need to stand in front of the thousands, or it's not thousands, but the huge amount of different varieties and start from the beginning as to what I like. Bias is also a very handy shortcut. It allows us to look at a menu and discount all of the meat if I happen to be a vegetarian. So bias in and of itself isn't necessarily negative. It's the impact of our behaviors when we have had a biased thought. That is what is most important when it comes to bias, because we are all biased. And that's where the controversy starts to come in, because not everyone is comfortable thinking that they are biased, but we all absolutely are, because it's dual processing. The brain does the quick scan of what's going on, If something is more complex, then we push it into our conscious thinking. Our PFC takes over. That uses 20% of the body's resources. So now I am consciously thinking. If I don't have to consciously think, my brain will make sure that I don't. Okay. So if that's bias, what are the biases? And there are so many. There have been so many lists. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you a list of some of the most usual biases and what they do. So if we go on to the next slide, Rena.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's really, really helpful. And I just want to underline one really important aspect that Maria has talked about, that sometimes we even react to the word called bias because it almost makes us feel it's something that's not good, right? So immediately you start thinking, oh, I'm biased against something, but you can be biased positively, as she was talking about, as well as have a negative bias as well. So let's be aware of it, that perhaps there are already filters that come in our mind when we talk about unconscious bias and the training that organizations are doing. However, the reason why some of the negative bias can start creating a problem is because of two reasons. One is, as Maria was talking about, when there is something which is perceived as a threat to us, what happens is that our mind pays more attention to it. And I have learned from Maria and from a lot of people out there who would already be knowing this concept, that when the brain perceives a threat, it's your amygdala that comes into action. So the logical, let's think whether it is the right thing to do or not, or all people are equal, goes out of the window, because the brain is perceiving it as a threat and is giving you only three choices. And I'm going to use simple words, but you can imagine the applications of it might be different. You're either going to fight it, i.e. you're going to push against that bias because you're seeing it as a threat, or you're going to freeze, i.e. you're not going to welcome that bias because you see it as a threat, or you will, so it's fight, flight, and freeze, right? Or you'll fly, or you'll run away from that bias, i.e. you'll push people aside, or you'll move away from that scenario. And that's what's important, because when these biases come into play, as a business person, as a business leader, as a team member, your reactions get limited to those three. And hence it becomes important to become aware about them. But what are these biases, right? And as Maria was talking about it, the lists are so many. And to be honest, I began to list them out, and then I thought, wait a minute, let me just do a quick check about people who've already done work on it. So I've actually given credit to the site that I have picked it up from. So thank you to those wonderful people. And there could be more that you can add on. But let's kind of go through some of them, because the reason we are putting it down here, and I know we have asked that cheeky question about what biases you carry, but also for you to be aware that you might be noticing other people in the organization who have these kind of biases that are there. So I'm just going to kickstart a few of them. Some of them are quite kind of familiar as terminologies, but you can see that it might be coming in. So if I was to just go down the thing and pick up a few that is hitting me, ageism is something which is so prevalent. There are certain biases that we have about what young people can or cannot do, or what older people can or cannot do, right? You know that, and I know that there are biases around them. Or sometimes it is something known as an affinity bias, i.e. you think that you belong to a certain community and therefore people will be biased, or have a bias that that's how we're all going to be behaving. Or it might be a confirmation bias, i.e. you look at a person, let's presume you see somebody come in with really bright colors, right? Just as an example. And you might think, oh, that person is quite gregarious and outgoing. And then you start looking for information that will confirm that initial bias or that initial perception that you created about the person. It's the point that Maria was making, is that sometimes we have a bias, and when we're looking at social media, our brain tries to pick up those things which will reconfirm the bias that we felt in the first instance. So it's again limiting us from what might not be visible or might be out there, because we're limiting how we're kind of going to pick that up as well. There are some really interesting ones out here which I kind of saw, which is the halo effect and the horns effect as well. When you look at a leader, You think, oh, the person should have certain kind of characteristics. So you presume and you don't look at the darker side that the person might be behaving, because you expect the person to have certain expertise, a certain kind of knowledge. So you will not question it. You'll take it for granted. You'll go and follow the line because there's a certain halo effect that's there, or a horns effect. You have a person who's asked a lot of questions in a meeting, and you start thinking, well, that person is quite a bit of a rebellion. So the next time the person makes a point in the meeting, you might reject it because you're like, always the aggressive rebellion kind of person. So those are the kind of biases that come in because of what we're perceiving out here. I'm just going to pause there and invite Maria to pick up a couple others that she might have seen as well.
One of the things that is just, I think, really prevalent at the moment is the beauty bias. If we find someone beautiful, we attribute them a whole bunch of very, very positive qualities, but we don't know them, especially nowadays in social media. We'll follow someone on Instagram because we like the look of their life. However, we're getting a very, very brief snapshot. So it's also about realizing that actually unconscious bias is that brief snapshot. The brain's looking to process that information quickly. The other thing that's really important about all of these biases is there's an intersectionality about them. So it's also looking at the fact that actually you could have the halo effect around the beauty and the ageism could all be having those intersections because it's someone young who's very pretty, so therefore you're attributing. So in the same way that the brain is outrageously complex, this topic is very, very complex because it's layering on top of other biases that we have that we're unaware of. That's why it's unconscious bias. But they have an effect. And the effect that they have, well, that's the next slide.
Absolutely. And think about even some of the ones that are out there. And yep, let me pick up. How is it that they start affecting? So this slide is, let's take up a few examples that we shared about the kind of biases and how they might be impacting. But this is where it starts creating a problem. Remember, we're talking about there are some biases which are positive. The only reason why we are in this conversation talking about the so-called negative unconscious biases, because they create a problem. They create a problem for the individual. They create a problem for the team and the culture that you might be creating within the organization. They create a problem for business bottom line. And all of these are really important in today's day of time. I mean, we know that there's so much of disruption. Leaders, team members, cultures, organizations really need to play their A game. So therefore, it becomes really important to unpack and see what are these hidden barriers? What are these unconscious filters that might be existing in people that might be tripping them over, right? So how is it that it could affect? So think about affinity bias. It comes up so much in recruitment process, right? We like people who are like us. We like people who behave like us, right? So we can kind of tend to choose people who might be kind of aligned to our kind of style per se, or any of the other biases you think about, and you see that it starts affecting decision making, innovation that you might be doing in an organization, the kind of suppliers you might be choosing. Can you imagine a person who is getting the negative side of a horns effect might lead up to stress, a lower morale, talent intake gets impacted, retention levels get impacted, there's a culture of exclusion that might be created. These are real things. And anybody listening to this video cast that we're doing will realize that these are real issues that we all experience and are experiencing. And if for a moment, if you reflect, you might realize it might be because of the unconscious bias that's there within individuals as a collective, and are pleased to really look at it. Because if we're serious about things like business bottom lines, if we're really serious about things like sustainability development goals, the SDGs, then we really have to look at that there are no biases that are coming in the way. But what's the reality right now? Here are some of the headlines that have been emerging in the recent past, which are really, really important for us to keep in context of why we're having this conversation. In 2019, you had Prince Harry from the UK, warning unconscious bias and its connection to racism. And we've seen it play out in the media. We've seen people agreeing and disagreeing to it. But there have been some people who have agreed to the fact that there might be some kind of unconscious bias that exists, and we know it does exist. I mean, if I'm quoting this correctly, I think apparently the Queen also made a statement of saying maybe we need to have somebody, who's looking after the diversity agenda for, the royalty as well. So it's an important topic. Then you had, but then you had this whole sea of organizations that were pushing it aside and saying it's not important. In fact, BBC in 2020 said that the ministers had said that unconscious bias training was not important. It was not working. I don't think they said it was not important, but they certainly said that it was not working, and it was being scrapped for civil servants in England. And then you have in 2021, it is May, not Mary 2021, but May 2021, that BBC confirmed that 95% of their staff were going to complete unconscious bias training. So there is this whole conversation that's taking place between the controversies around it. So let's talk a little bit more about the controversies around it.
So one of the reasons that unconscious bias is such a controversial subject is because nobody wants to think they're not open-minded. We've all got access nowadays in the first world, if we're lucky enough, to a huge amount of information, knowledge. We call ourselves open-minded. Everyone, you ask everyone, anyone, unless they are totally black and white about who they are, everyone will say they believe in diversity and equality. Everyone totally says that society should be fair. Opportunities of choice at work should be fair. If a man's doing a job and a woman's doing the same job, they should get paid the same kind of thing. So one of the first resistances to bias is the fact that actually, unless I know the neuroscience of it, do I want to admit that I'm biased? However, that's a bias in itself, isn't it? It's kind of the snake eating its own tail, because in actual fact, we have to be biased. It's the brain's shortcut to allowing us to process the huge amount of information that's coming into us. And this is from evolution. There was a huge amount of information we were receiving as we were evolving. It's not just about the modern day. We've always had biases. So, for example, affinity bias. One of the first biases, because I needed to know who was in my tribe and who wasn't, because that was a matter of life and death. So the fact that people are naturally resistant is not surprising. The brain's going to turn around and push away something that actually makes me feel like I'm not the kind of best version of myself. But the problem with that is, if someone is thinking that they don't have biases, they are missing the opportunity, A, to get close to them and become familiar, but also what can you do to overturn that if it's having a negative impact? I'm left-handed. I have a huge amount of bias when people go, oh, I'm left-handed too. Us having an affinity bias with other left-handed people makes no difference. It has no impact on anyone else's life. We all moan about the fact that scissors don't work for us as well, because they're done for right-handed people, but we don't go on a massive protest about it. So that's a very silly but very useful example of the fact that we will have biases, but we don't want to necessarily admit we have them because it doesn't speak to our better selves. There's also the difficulty with training. If you've got someone who doesn't believe that they have biases, going on unconscious bias training is not going to land for them. They will be perpetually resistant. However, in the next slide, what is shown, the research, and there's been a great deal of research, is that unconscious bias training does seem to teach people about the negative implicit bias, but that there is a unintentional backlash effect, which actually strengthens the negative associations. And that's just brain wiring. If I put a thought, if I have any kind of thought, I have a set of neural pathways which have energy going down them, biomechanical energy that light them up, and therefore that thought is reinforced. I talked earlier about myelination. If I have that thought time and time again, it's reinforced. So therefore, if training is only about raising awareness of people's implicit associations and their negative biases, it's actually going to accidentally reinforce the bias. I remember doing some training with the Emerald Publishing Company, a global publishing company. And one of the things that they were very clear on is that as we list this, can people own it? But then there needed to be a gap, because I may initially, when I am talking about biases as a trainer, actually fire up your internal biases. It's what we do afterwards. And that's a subject that we're going to be talking about in our second part of this TBQ session on unconscious biases. So the controversy is, does the training as it stands at the moment work? One of the training tools that you use very, very often is the Harvard Implicit Association Test, the IAT. And even now, the people who designed that are saying, don't use this as a tool. All it's going to do is show people where their biases are and make them think about it, which is going to make them more biased if they keep thinking about their biases. So I would suggest that training in its current state does need to be addressed, because it's really important not just to raise awareness, because raising awareness, fantastic. There are other steps that need to be taken. If we're talking about a system that's been in the brain since we've had brains, so we're talking at least 100,000 years, so possibly more. I pulled that figure out of the air, and actually we've been around longer than that. The point I am making, though, is in its current format, it can accidentally reinforce unconscious biases rather than actually address that issue. And the thing about unconscious bias is it has impacts. And one of the ways of having a look is seeing the impact. And training at the moment is having the opposite and counterintuitive impact. So I understand why there's this controversy, in the same way that I understand why people who feel that they're pretty woke, evolved, and have worked on themselves are not happy to say, I am full of bias. But that misses the opportunity that our genius brains give us, which is we can shorthand a great deal, but let's make sure we shorthand the right stuff and not the wrong stuff. What are your thoughts on that, Rena?
Absolutely. So I have to kind of apologize because I have been like all over the place a little bit because of the noise that's been in the background. So given this is live, my apologies, or the recording that you've been listening to, but absolutely following the conversation. And it's so important, the points that Maria is talking about, because so my background's also corporate HR. I've done that for about 20 years. I was responsible for launching the global diversity strategy for Aviva in 2008. And I worked on it with 26 countries for about a good 3 years. I do a lot of diversity training. I'm involved in women leadership programs. And often what comes up is that these biases are existing. However, as Maria was talking about, is because we don't know what to really do with them, or how to address them, or how to help people to change them, it just becomes a reinforcement, and people walk away with a statement of saying, oh, so we all know that biases exist. Yes, it's a very natural part of the human brain and how it functions. And so, yeah, get even more comfortable with the concept and then walk away without making any change. And that itself creates a problem, because biases, as we just seen in some of the examples, can be quite a deterrent. And for a moment, what I'm going to do actually, because I'm very conscious that I might have been disturbed at that moment of time, and we do have a few minutes, I'm going to go back to the slide which talked about the different kind of biases. But I just want to pull out a few of them which we might not have been able to pull off, just to reinforce, now that we have talked about what the bias is, what the controversy is. I'm just going to revisit the slide for a few minutes just to bring to light and raise the awareness of the bias that might exist in us or within our organization or culture or society for that matter. So some of the ones that we talked about, and I'm just going to repeat them as well. In fact, I might just lean on and see some of my notes and kind of talk about them themselves. So affinity bias, we talked about already, where people refer to, you see somebody with shared qualities, and so that helps you decide whether you like the person or, for that matter, not like the person, right? That's affinity bias. Attribution bias is all about, how you perceive your action and those of others. So because you think that certain behaviors lead to success or not, you attribute a person's behavior to being successful or not without really trying to dig deeper and saying how other people are reacting to that behavior. Beauty bias, I love the way that Maria talked about it, so I'm not going to repeat that particular aspect. Now, conformity bias is something that happens when a person uses sway too much by those of people around them. So think about new joiners in an organization. Sometimes they tend to look up to experts or leaders. And so sometimes they have this conformity bias. They may or may not, and it might be for people who are in an organization for longer. And therefore, they want to hold on. They seek acceptance from, because they want to seek acceptance from other people, they will conform to the views of those authority figures that might be there around them. Now, we've all heard about gender bias and age bias. We've talked about that already, but it's so prevalent. Even after years of talking about gender bias, we still know that it exists within an organization in very, very subtle ways. So these are some things that are existing within the organization, and I really would welcome you to think about, use this as a checklist to see what are the biases that might be existing within the organization and how it might be impacting the decisions you're making, the kind of creativity that you're unable to really unpack and unleash within your organization. The kind of effort impact is happening on employees, the people that you're taking within your team, within your organization, the people that you're choosing to work with. All of these can create big, big problems. So we just want you to pay attention on what would be the possible impacts because of these biases that are existing within the organization. And just to wrap up today's conversation and make some thoughts about this whole controversy that we've been talking about, is whether to do the training or not to do the training. I think this is a great way to be able to summarize this perhaps on this slide to all that Maria and I are trying to put across to you today. So what's happening is that because companies are focusing only on awareness building, and let's face it, when I look at the DNI training that's taking place, and a lot of research has happened on unconscious bias training, it's probably half an hour or 1 hour in the entire DNI training that's taking place. Or in some organizations in the induction training, they might have half an hour or 1 hour of DNI training, and somewhere in between it might be talked about, unconscious bias exists and we need to be careful about it. They might not be using this language, but that's the essence. I mean, how can you cover something which is so deep seated in such a short period of time? And even if you do, all you're doing is building awareness. You're not helping people really recognize that because of our inherent biases, how does it impact my decision making? How does it impact the way that I react to people who are different to me? And how I might want to change, because even change takes a certain amount of training and learning and unlearning and relearning as well, right? So if you're just going to do a part of the unconscious bias training, of course it'll have no results. And of course it'll lead to people saying, let's put it up on the shelf because we'd rather give training on topics that matter, which might help our business bottom line. And our argument is that this will help business bottom line, but you just need to do it fully and properly. And we'll talk more about it in our next conversation in part 2. The other element, which
Can I just make a really quick point there that came to my mind when you were speaking, Rena? Babies are born with virtually no bias. We learn our bias from our environment, our parents, our society, and our culture. So if we do learn them, what's wonderful about the brain is we can unlearn them as well. So I thought that was an important point to make.
Absolutely. I'm sure the minute I said relearn, something got triggered in your brain. You were like, yeah, the brain can unlearn and relearn. Absolutely. But it needs to do that. Because going back to what Maria was talking of, is because the way the brain kind of starts strengthening neurological pathways that helps it to be efficient and use energy efficiently, it will not automatically remind you of the bias that's there because it's just being an efficient organ per se.
Yeah.
And the other aspect that I think as an argument we want to put forward is that it's not just training. You can train your people, but if the systems and processes in an organization do not support that behavioral change, do not help people to really measure whether there's a difference taking place in the decision making that's taking place, in the innovation, in the impact of behaviors of leaders and team members, there has to be a systemic change as well. And one of those kind of systemic changes is something that we'll cover off next time, because then you're empowering people with really in-depth training and then making the system support that change that's taking place within the organization. And our argument also is that when you're talking about unconscious bias, because it is so deep rooted, let's not look at the superficial stuff about, whether there's just it's important to look at the superficial top of the rung about whether there's gender bias or whether there's cultural bias. It's important, but what's important is to tap deeper and help people fundamentally understand that there are filters and there are underlined belief systems that we have that kind of create these biases. And again, remember, biases can be positive as well as negative. But it's really when you empower people with the knowledge of how does bias really get created? What's the neuroscience behind it? How can I reframe these filters that are embedded in my brain? It is only then that you empower people to really do something around unconscious bias. So that's our argument of saying, don't put this topic away. Don't put it on the top shelf, dust it off, bring it out, but do it properly, because when you do, it can create a massive, massive difference. I'm going to hand it back to Maria for a couple of closing comments, and then I'll make a couple of closing comments, and we'll wrap up for today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rena. It's so important not to put it away. It's to revisit it. Because one of the things that happens is, as awareness is raised, like Rena said earlier, people kind of go, well, it's natural. And that then becomes almost permission to sit in your comfort zone. And yet, in real terms, training could really stretch and challenge. And most people are wanting to be the best version of themselves. That's why there's that initial personal resistance to even thinking about the fact that we're biased. So also part of the opportunity is normalizing the conversations, not putting the training away, and then deepening. We are an iceberg, all of us. We have so many filters. We have so many unique experiences. Actually knowing what our biases are within and of ourselves can actually make us so much more powerful, because we can leverage what works for us. I always choose chocolate ice cream because it's never going to get better than that. And we can rewire what doesn't work for us. I remember seeing a woman walking towards me with my car battery and going, why isn't a man fitting it? And then suddenly hearing my brain and just giving myself a really good talking to, because that was just silly. She fitted my battery better than anyone else could have done. So it's also about allowing this subject to just be around. And one of the reasons that Rena and I picked this up today is, if people are looking to put it on the top shelf, as two people who've got 50 years experience between us, we know that that won't take us forward. And TBQ is always about making sure that we are as brilliant and use all of our brilliant brain as well as we possibly can. Over to you, Rena.
Thank you so much for your closing comments. Absolutely, Maria. I totally agree with you on this entire concept about how can you be brilliant. And the reason why we really felt it was important to cover this onto TBQ Live, not just because it's one of the 9 levers there, it's because of the times that we are in right now. Even more so today, we need all of us to be playing our best game so that we can support each other, our businesses, the environment, the society. There's so many issues that need to be tackled. And if this is a tripwire, then we need to be careful of this tripwire, because this tripwire could create a lot of problem. And my concern is that how we are, just because it's a difficult subject and a complex subject, we are brushing it aside and saying, oh, it doesn't work. And then if that becomes the narrative of authority figures, it creates a problem, because a lot of people then start thinking, maybe it doesn't work. And our argument is it does work when you do it properly. And that's what we're going to cover off next time in part 2, which is actually going to be next Thursday, July 1st, and it's going to be the same time as we did it today, which is at 12:15 UK London time. Please do join us. And if you are listening to this recording, thank you so much for listening to the recording and for being with us. And once again, I apologize for any glitches that might have happened because of where I was sitting today. But in the meantime, thank you for being here. Have a lovely day, and thank you for all that you do. This is Maria Chase and Veena Dayal signing off for TBQ Live today on June 24th, and we'll be back on the 1st of July. Bye for now. Take care.
Bye for now. Thank you for coming.